Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. One of the outcomes of the pandemic is that more of us are working remotely. And so many of my clients tell me that the opportunity to work remotely has gifted them much needed flexibility as a working mother. They're saving time on commuting, have less travel costs, and most have more of a work-life balance. However, hybrid and remote working can impact career progression, particularly for women, due to proximity bias. The so-called proximity bias is that this unconscious tendency to give preferential treatment to those that are in our immediate vicinity. And it's kind of based on our evolutionary cognitive decision making. It's kind of used as a mental shortcut to prioritise what feels safest because it's a known entity. And I get it, it makes sense. But the problem is that proximity bias is likely to affect women disproportionately, with us going on maternity leave, taking career breaks, working remotely, all increase the likelihood of us being penalised as a result of proximity bias. So what can we do to overcome that risk and the impact that it can have on us? Well, my guest today is here to help us. My guest is Lauren Curry, OBE, and Lauren is the founder of Upfront, an organisation that's on a mission to change confidence, visibility and power for 1 million women and non-binary people. Thousands of women from over 50 countries have graduated from Upfront's flagship programme, the Upfront Bond. Upfront is the world's top choice for women and organisations that are interested in their confidence, serving clients such as Nike, the Ministry of Defence, British Red Cross, and Upfront is building a genuine global movement. Lauren is also the chairperson of a leading maternity discrimination charity called Pregnant Then Screwed, who you're probably aware of, and has been recognised as a woman changing the world by Elle magazine and one of the top businesswomen under 35 by Management Today. In 2017, she was awarded an OBE for her services to design and diversity. And Lauren grew up in Scotland and now lives in Stockholm with her partner and a 5-year-old son. And I can't wait to dive into this conversation with Lauren because I know it's going to be so full of wisdom and insights. So I won't keep you any longer. Let's welcome Lauren. So welcome, Lauren. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, Nikki. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So for people that don't know about you and your work, would you mind just sharing a bit about who you are, what you do, and actually how you came to do this really important work that you do in the world?
Yes. So I'm Lauren and I'm an entrepreneur, I think is the short answer to your question. So I have been building businesses and ventures in and around social change and social problems since I graduated from art school in 2008. And kind of halfway through that journey, which I'm sure we'll get into, I found myself being a woman with power and influence. So, I would be invited to speak on stages and would win fancy awards and find myself with a seat at the table, as we say, and was just completely dismayed and perplexed as to why I was so often the only woman in those spaces. And that was the start of my journey of understanding gender inequality, inequity, the patriarchy, how systemic oppression works, all light-hearted fun topics, and which led to me building Upfront, which is now my full-time business. I'm the CEO and the founder there. And we are on a mission to support 1 million women with confidence and visibility and power. And I know we're going to talk a bit more about that in this conversation. And otherwise, I am a mum. My son is 5 and I'm from Scotland, as you can probably tell. So I grew up in Ayrshire near Glasgow, and 2 years ago we moved to Sweden. So I now live in Stockholm with my family.
Fantastic. And that is a very much a whistle-stop tour, so I love that. Yeah. Before we get into the questions that we're obviously going to be talking about today around visibility, Talk me through a bit of that journey then. So you went to art kind of college and then kind of
Hmm.
found yourself as this entrepreneur that then had, as you say, this voice and a place at the table. So would you mind just sharing a bit more about that journey and what that looked like?
Of course. So, I was very lucky that I found the thing, if you like, that lit a fire in my belly at a really early age. And I also had a very supportive family, and I had an incredible art teacher called Mr. Grant, who I have a photo of him on my desk. And that meant that probably when I was around 13, 14, I was really introduced to the world of design. So Mr. Grant opened my eyes to the truth that every single thing we touch and use in our day to day has been designed by somebody. Somebody has decided what it looks like, how it works. And this just blew me away. I was obsessed and fascinated. And so decided that was it. I was going to be a product designer, and I would make chairs for IKEA, and I would make fancy lampshades that would be sold in fancy restaurants. And so off I went to art school to be the next James Dyson. So I was inhaling, autobiographies from James Dyson, Richard Branson, Philip Stark, and I do think back and think, I wonder how that would have changed for me if I'd been exposed to any women, because there weren't any really on my radar at that time. And so went to art school to study product design. And then really quickly into my studies, I was introduced to this kind of emerging discipline called service design, which has a lot in common with product design. But of course, you're not designing objects, you're designing intangible services. And that was my kind of next big epiphany moment, where it was like, okay, so every single service, from booking a holiday, going to the GP, and everything in between, buying a cup of coffee, organising a funeral, these are services that actually most of the time have not been designed. That's why most of them, a lot of them are not fit for purpose and can cause harm and upset. And of course, we all have experience of brilliant service where it has been designed and you're delighted and you're taken care of, and it makes a huge difference. And so that was around kind of early 2000s, and service design was a very kind of emerging field. There was a few books had been written. There was a few academics, a few agencies and consultancies. And so while I was studying, I just took it upon myself to make friends with all those people and really put myself out there in the industry, with a view to, getting a job. I was thinking to myself, I want to be a service designer when I graduate. So how do I become known in this industry? How do I build a reputation and a network around myself? And then when I graduated, all the jobs were in London. And long story short, decided to build my own business together with a business partner in Scotland. And that was one of the UK's first service design agencies that was focused on the public sector and focused on how can we use creativity to make public services better. And so, yeah, I built that for many years. And that was, yeah, the rest is history, I guess.
Fantastic, because I'm always curious about how people come to do what they do.
Mm.
So, obviously, today we're going to be talking about the issue of proximity bias and how, particularly as working mothers, we can navigate this. So, your expertise is around confidence and visibility, and particularly, as you said earlier, where visibility meets intersectionality. So, how did you come to focus on this? So, you said actually you found yourself at a place at the table and recognise that actually there were few women, if any, at that table. But what then led you on that path to kind of explore that further?
So I think it was fueled by my frustration and kind of disbelief as to why are these spaces so boring, quite frankly. It's like the same ideas, the same men who look and sound the same, regurgitating the same stories. And I couldn't understand why I know lots of brilliant women, but yet they're not putting themselves forward to be in these positions and they're not invited into these spaces. And that's for a couple of reasons that are both important. Like, one is that of course, I was naive. I wasn't thinking about intersectionality. I wasn't thinking about race. I wasn't thinking about systemic injustice and change. But at the same time, I'd also believed what we're all taught from a very young age, which is this idea of meritocracy and the idea that the best person for the job gets the job and the best speaker is the person who's put on the stage. I believed all these stories that came from very valid sources. And of course, now I'm on a lifelong journey of unlearning those stories because we now know that none of that is true and our society is deeply, deeply unequal in many, many different ways. And so I think, that was a realization that came over time, and it's one that I'm still on and will always be on, understanding how our, whether it's our ethnicity, whether it's our religion, where we grow up in the world, our accents, our sexuality, all of these things have a huge impact on how we perceive ourselves and how the world perceives us. And these things determine who is invited into certain spaces, who feels they have permission to behave in a certain way, to be in certain spaces. And all of these ideas are inherently linked to confidence and visibility. And I can see a crisis of confidence in myself, in the women around me, and my girlfriends, and my mum and her friend, in so many areas of my life. Women walking through the world blaming themselves for this lack of self doubt, uh, forgive me, like self doubt, lack of confidence. Maybe it's having too much ambition, not having enough ambition. We've all got our versions of those stories. And I think once I could see it for what it was, you can't unsee it. And that's been a fire in my belly for, you know, 7 years now that is just burning brighter and brighter all the time, because the more you learn, the more you understand that you don't know, and you realize the depth of how much you still have to learn about how these things work. And the designer in me, which I really do credit a lot to how I work and how I build my businesses and how I solve problems and think about things, because the designer in me is the trained to take action. It's like, how can we prototype something small that might make a tiny bit of this problem be better? And I think that's what my superpower is. That's where Upfront began. And it's still my kind of approach as Upfront evolves and our impact grows and our team scales. It's about, what can we do with the influence and the power and resources that we do have, the agency that we do have, to help individuals and also help change the system at the same time.
I love that. And just, thank you for walking that journey and doing the work that you do, because it makes such a difference and it is so needed. But it sounds like there wasn't a defining moment. It kind of happened over time, that the more you learned, the more you saw, the more you couldn't unsee it. And so it kind of built that way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, the very first kind of iteration of Upfront was never ever supposed to be a business, or didn't have any plan or strategy. It was me having a big red sofa on stage with me so that people with stage fright could sit on the sofa and essentially acclimatize to being on the other side of the stage. Because when I was having these conversations about why do we not see more women on stage, and it's important to remember as well, like around this time of 2016, nobody was asking these questions. Like, nobody was talking about gender, nobody was talking about sexism, nobody was challenging the all male panel. Like, my kind of challenge at the time were whispers that most people either ignored or didn't listen to. And when I was asking those questions, of course, I heard lots of stories with lots of different facets to them, but I did keep hearing this particular point about standing up on a big raised stage. People just saying, I would never do that. Like, never, no way. Like, that's something that people over there do. And I'm like, hold on a minute. In every area of our professional development, if we want to build a new skill or learn a new thing, then we get to practice. We can work with a coach, we can go to on a course, we can read a book, but then we're all expected to just one day stand up on a stage and be great speakers. And so the upfront couch was for people who were at so early stages of that journey, like couldn't even bear to think about introducing themselves on stage, never mind giving a talk. And so they would sit on stage, I would introduce them, I'd tell the audience. So I might say, you know, this is Nikki, she's here on stage with me today because she absolutely hates the sound of her own voice. She's often been asked to talk on stage and she always says no because it scares her too much, but she really would love to talk about how we can support working mums. You know, imagine that was you like 30 years ago, because we all were nervous one day, right? You don't just you don't just begin being good at this. And then, like the first time we tried it out at a conference, we had like 50 people wanted to sit on this like 4-seater couch. So we ended up like getting deck chairs and making it a bit bigger. And the people who sat on the couch just really loved it. Like some of them were really transformed and very impacted by, you know, it's such a deceptively simple idea. And again, one at the time, so many people did not get it. They were ignoring me, laughing at me, telling like, why would anybody want to sit on a couch and not speak? But I knew that it was really helping people. And the first time we did it, it was like, we're really onto something. So then every time I gave a keynote, I would have the upfront couch. Then I had friends who were speakers and I'd say to them, you know, I'd say, Nikki, you've got this keynote coming up next week. Do you want to be up front? Here's how it works. My mum made we upfront cushion covers and we used to post them to the different conferences. And for a long time, it was just that, you know, and that was, I had my other business. I paid an intern to kind of help me do the emails and manage the people on the couch and make sure they were okay. And then over time, you know, when we'd have debrief calls, these people would be just so buzzing, like, Lauren, this was amazing. Do you have a book or a course or a podcast? And what do I do now? And I'm like, I don't have any of those things. And so that was when I kind of looked out into the world to think, where can I send these people? Like, what is in the world for these people? Most of them women, many of them black and brown people, many of them queer. Like, where do they go to learn how to have confidence in their own story and their voice and build stage presence and give presentations? And I just really did not see anywhere that I felt I could send them. And so that was the start of me building a solution, which is, of course, now our brilliant organization.
Yes. Oh, what a story. And I love that it came from just an intention of wanting to help and where it's got to now. So obviously we're going to be diving into the topic of visibility. How would you define that? So what does visibility mean for you?
So up front, we define visibility around permission. So it's giving yourself permission to take opportunities for your voice, your purpose, your point of view, your work, and your opinions and ideas to be seen, heard, and celebrated. And I think the few words there that really feel fizzy to me is this idea of take. So it's, you have to take these things. You are not waiting for them to be given to you, and you're not waiting for permission. And also the idea of, yes, it's being seen and heard, but it's also being celebrated. Because for me, I think a lot of the narrative around visibility seems to be very dominated by selling, which I understand that women who run businesses need to sell stuff, and part of what is a block there is visibility. And it's something that I help the women and non-binary people in our program with that. But I also think it's such a shame that that seems to be, now we think visibility is about selling stuff, and I don't think it is that at all. I think it's so much more than that.
Absolutely. So you've talked about how you've over the years come to see the systemic issues with this. So in your experience for women, in particular for mothers who mostly my audience are, when it comes to visibility, what do you see from this system's perspective? What's the kind of stuff that we're having to swim through?
I mean, a lot. And I think we're in a deep sea. Um, and that environment is inherently capitalist, patriarchal, racist. So that means that the people who get listened to are the loudest people and the white people. And I think we need to acknowledge the scale of how deep those oppressive forces run in that kind of larger context. And then when I think about, the mums who will be listening to this whilst breastfeeding during the night, or in the car park while their toddler's asleep in the back seat, we see it in our children. Or certainly, I see it in my son, that we were all born with tons of confidence and courage and bravery and joy and hope and playfulness and all the things that we need to be visible in inverted commas, all the things we need to show up on in the world in our terms. But of course, then as we grow and we start to become aware of the world that we are existing in, oppressive forces start to shape and mold us. And so what I see in the women that we work with is that you start to believe these things linked to your discomfort with visibility are part of your personality, where actually they are not part of your personality. They are behaviors that you have been taught to display by the world. You've been rewarded for displaying behaviors that minimize your visibility. So you might believe that you've just never been comfortable speaking in front of people, or you've never been comfortable speaking about your achievements, and these are just part of your personality. Like, ultimately, all these behaviors and these limiting beliefs are rooted in society's very clear expectation that women, and mothers in particular, put the needs of everybody else above their own. And that is something that girls are taught from a very early age. We see it in the data from children as young as 5 and 6, where girls are rewarded for being obedient and thoughtful and calm, and boys are rewarded for being boisterous and adventurous and breaking the rules and challenging the status quo. So, yeah, that's how I think about the systemic relationship we have with visibility.
No, I love that. And I love how you said that actually we take them on, that they're almost like our personality traits. It's almost like we um, swallow it and it becomes part of us. And actually it never was. It's interesting. I've got a 10-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter. And my daughter has said to me on a number of different occasions now, and I'm really hot on this. It kind of is like a lightning bolt goes through me. She keeps telling me I'm shy. And shy is not a word we ever use in our house. There might be times when we're feeling less confident. It doesn't mean we're not confident. So I'm really clear on there's a difference between how, we're feeling and it labeling it to our identity. And I have no idea. And I've even said to a school teacher, like, is this a word you use in the classroom? And her school teacher's like, no. And I'm like, where has she picked that up from? Because that she's not shy, she's not introverted, she's not. So I'm really fascinated by kind of where it gets seeps in, and it's like the gender stereotypes, and as you say, and at such a young age. So by the time, as you say, we're at a point in our career where we're like, actually, I want to, or I need to step up and be more visible, how many barriers there are in place to do that.
I was going to say the shy thing is a big conversation in our house because my son is very introverted, and it's been really quite challenging for me as someone who's naturally very extroverted to have such an introverted child, and to be really mindful of me not projecting how I would want to show up at the party, which is the opposite of how he wants to show up at the party. And I actually recorded a podcast with Dr. Marta, who's a great child psychologist who has a super page on Instagram that I'm sure lots of your followers will already know of. And her and I talked about, as exactly as you say, the importance of labeling shyness as a feeling and not a trait. Because it's like even the most extroverted of us have felt shy. It's like we've all been on a first date and felt shy. That doesn't mean you are a shy person. It means you're having shy feelings in that moment. And I'm really struck by when we're in social situations, and it's a conversation I've had to have with his grandparents and our friends, because very quickly it becomes, oh, he's shy, he's just really shy. And I think that's a label that, if you give a child a label, they will absorb it and start to, live that label. So I think it's really important, but with boys and girls, but I think in the context of our conversation, these messages they're so insidious and so entrenched in our everyday that even people like us who are working in this space for our careers and we spend all day having these conversations and thinking about it. There's still so much more to learn and so much that we don't see because we ourselves have had 30, 40 odd years of this conditioning as well. And I think, a lot of the women turn up at our programs because they have become a mother, and they have this really quite frightening moment of, I want to role model a new and better kind of confidence to my children, because that is what they are looking to us for. Like this, what does confidence look like? What does visibility look like? What does celebrating yourself look like? And if you don't know how to do that, then your sons and daughters won't know how to do that either. So they'll copy what they see on TV, and nobody wants that.
Yeah. Oh, what a powerful intention. And I think we're going to dive into some of this. So how do we do it? Obviously, we're going to be looking at this through the lens, particularly of the proximity bias. So how are you seeing the proximity bias impact women and working mothers?
So I think there's absolutely no denying that it's a thing. It's a very real bias. There's lots of data that shows that it is negatively impacting women, negatively impacting mothers, also even more so if you're black or brown, because we also see that people from marginalized communities, they are going to suffer discrimination and microaggressions in a physical work environment. So often they will choose to work remotely, and that's going to be better for their mental health. But of course, then the proximity bias consequence can mean that they do not receive the same opportunities, do not receive the same opportunities for promotion. So I think it's very real. And, if we could wave a magic wand and have all the leaders of organizations in the world pay attention to this conversation, that would be nice. But we do not live in utopia. And the leaders of the organizations are not listening to this podcast, unfortunately. So then, I think our perspective on it is working with whole organizations where So we have our bond, which is our 6-week online program. That's our kind of flagship product. So we run one public bond every year where anybody can turn up and buy a ticket. So you might be a primary school teacher, a nurse, an engineer at NASA, a jeweler. Everybody's welcome. We have our last bond, we had 515 people from 25 different countries. So really diverse. But we also now run that same program just for organizations. So someone you mentioned, we talked about our mutual friend who used to work at one of the big supermarkets. So let's say ASDA say to us, we want to run an ASDA bond with 1,000 women and non-binary people who work at ASDA. And so what we are doing through that work is it's that balance of we can't control cultures and systems, we can control behaviours and habits, but then behaviours and habits are what inform cultures and systems. And so in our programs, we spend a lot of time on the centre of that Venn diagram. So, for example, meeting culture, like meetings are a huge part of everybody's working day. They are the space where decisions get made, where people are assessed, where work gets done. And in so many organizations, meetings are poorly designed. Often they don't have the right technology, so people who are working at home or remotely can't contribute in the right way. And so that's just one example of when you put a spotlight on something like a meeting and say, how do we design this meeting so that A, it's productive and effective and efficient, but also so that everybody's voice is heard, so that everybody gets a chance to speak. Like that is radical in many of the organizations that we meet and work with. That idea is radical, and there'll be people listening and think, oh my God, my work needs that so much. And it's that type of work that I think we need to do, whether it's with Upfront, there's lots of brilliant organizations all over the world tackling different parts of the systems. I don't think one person or one team has the solution. You know, I think it's going to take all of us with our pickaxe at different parts of the wall to bring it down. And so I think it's about doing that work and also working with the leaders, you know, and I would class myself as this, as like leaders who are really intentionally building a culture and building their business in a way that is kind and fair and equitable. You know, my team is entirely remote. We don't use email. You know, we have a very high trust, high autonomy culture. And so it's people like us, and I'm sure you've got lots of clients who work the same. It's like, how can we share our wins, share the data behind how we are working, share the data that shows how we are working works.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't think there's a simple answer.
Yeah, there's so many threads that I want to unpick there. But the one thing that just jumped out at me is you said you don't use email.
No.
I love that. So what do you use? How do you communicate?
So my team communicate through Slack.
Okay, yeah.
And we only use email for external people who are not in our team. So I would never get an email from someone in my team. That would be very strange. And it works really well. You know, I think context is important, right? You know, we're a team under 10. Some of you will be listening, working in organizations where there's thousands upon thousands of employees. And, you know, I've done enough work with corporates to know that this context really, really matters. But I think often people, particularly mothers, can get stuck in this mindset of, I'm just really grateful to have a job because, you know, who would want little old me? And they forget that there's small startups, emerging, growing businesses who work in a very different way that would really love to have you.
Yeah. And you've just kind of led me into my next question, actually, because obviously we've talked about some of the systemic stuff, but I now wanted to move on to kind of what we can do as individuals about how sometimes we might get in our own way. And I think it's important to say that some of this it's absolutely not about blaming and shaming, because often, as we talked about earlier, we've internalized some of that misogyny and bias. But how do you see some of the women show up in your kind of work with what's the stuff that they're bringing that we can start to influence?
Yeah, I think I really like that you made the point of saying, this is not about blaming and shaming, but it's about understanding that we are also part of this problem. And I think it's too easy to get stuck in this binary, it's the men's fault or it's the white men's fault, because internalized misogyny, internalized prejudice, all of these biases are very real. I mean, even just looking at visibility, the data shows us that women women are more likely to negatively judge another woman for being seen to self-promote than men are. We know that 90% of all people of all genders in the world have a negativity bias towards women. And so I think it's really important for the mothers and the women listening to this to just sit with that and think about how to kind of accept that in a way that is not about being mean to yourself, in a way that is meeting yourself with self-compassion and kindness, but like, shit, I am also upholding a lot of these unhelpful beliefs and structures that keep the status quo exactly how it is. And then, as you say, I'm sorry,
I was going to say, and then how would that show up then? What would you see women kind of tending to say on your programs that would show? Because I imagine somebody's going, okay, I accept that I might have unconscious bias and prejudice towards women, which impacts how I show up. What do you see in terms of what people might say about their beliefs, or what actions do you see them take that kind of bring that alive?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two camps. I think folks who are in the bond are kind of ripe and ready for that. So there can be a lot of discomfort, there can be a lot of anger and sadness, and then a kind of fire around, I'm so happy I now know this and like I'm ready to learn. I think the other camp of that is often defensiveness, which of course is very understandable, because we can often get tied up in this idea of privilege, for example, and it's like, how can you say I'm privileged when I've had, maybe you've had a very, very difficult life, had horrible traumatic things happen to you, and it's like, absolutely, that is valid, but if you are a white person, you still have the privilege of being white, and that doesn't take away any of your trauma and pain. And so it really depends, where you're at. And I would say for those listening, no matter where you are, maybe you're listening to this thinking, I've never even heard of any of these ideas before. And I would just say to you, like, keep listening. It's not like, oh, now you need to go study a PhD in this incredibly complicated stuff. It's just keep engaging and keep your eyes and ears open, because really it's that old famous quote of the truth will, at first the truth will piss you off and then it'll set you free. And I really do believe that. And I think the way that it shows up, and the way that it shows up for, maybe I can talk about me in my life. The way that it shows up for me is judgment. So if I am in a place of scarcity and negativity, where I start falling for the trap, the blatant lie that there is not enough money, love, time, space for all women to thrive and survive, I will very quickly be in a place of judgment where I am judging myself very critically and harshly. and also judging the women around me. And I'm through the work that I do with my coach and my therapist, because I am absolutely not nowhere near perfect. Well, there's no such thing. I'm a flawed human, the same as everybody here, learning on a learning journey. It's like learning that the opposite of judgment is acceptance. So, it's accepting what is, accepting that I had time off work and that felt very indulgent, and at the same time I found it very difficult. For example, accepting that I have been on the move for the last 20 days, have not spent very much time with my son, and that's making me feel guilty. But at the same time, accepting that he really hasn't noticed that and is, it's had no negative impact on him. Whatever those kind of dichotomies are that you're playing with. And I think social media has a big role to play in this conversation, particularly around internalized misogyny and how women are pitted against each other. And it was really interesting, actually, and I'm curious to hear what you think, Nikki, if you saw this kind of unfold yesterday on Instagram, where there seems to be quite a few very vocal voices with very big platforms talking about the pain and trauma of infertility and wanting to have a baby and not being able to have one, and that being delivered with a message of, if you are one of the lucky ones, can you stop showing off and kind of keep your children to yourself because it's causing the rest of us so much pain. Now, I am summarizing and not doing a good job, but hopefully you can kind of get the key messages. And so then I could see lots of my friends and kind of community sharing, apologizing. I didn't know, and I'm sorry, and I'll do it. And that didn't feel good. And then I could see others saying, this is just completely off. Like, this is another way of pitting women against each other. And life is inherently unfair. Life is inherently unjust. And somewhat, you may have the children that you dreamed of having, but you might have lost your mother or lost your father or have some other extremely painful thing in your life. And I was like, oh my, as if this is happening on Mother's Day. Like, it's so fascinating to me to watch how, it's like a virus. It's like how it seeps into our front of mind and has us really questioning things in a way that is pitting us against each other. And I was really curious kind of watching that unfold yesterday on Mother's Day on Instagram. And then, of course, you have the really common, like, Instagram is rewarding us for showing us each other's shiny show reels. So it's like, look at me having the best day at work with the best team and the best results and the best shoes. And you're sitting in your jammies, not brushed your teeth, looking at that show reel, feeling terrible about yourself because you're comparing your kind of shitty first draft to someone else's show reel. And again, all of these algorithms are set up to reinforce scarcity, perfectionism. There's not enough space for all of us. And, I think part of what has made the Upfront Bond program as successful as it is we are really doubling down on community and celebration of self and each other. It's like, what would happen if you learned to celebrate yourself as much as you celebrate the women that you love, and then learn to celebrate the women that you've been taught to hate because they dress in a way you'd never dress, or they have a body shape that you have been taught to be disgusted by, or whatever it might be. And there's people who know far more about that aspect of it than I do, because it's a whole deep area, isn't it? Internalized misogyny.
And I love how you brought that to life with an example, because I think there is so much of that, that when we're talking about visibility, particularly, women are rewarded for being that self-sacrificing, self-effacing. And when we see other women do it, we might judge them negatively, which actually then puts a barrier to us ever doing it, because we're like, oh, I don't want to be seen to be kind of self-promoting or selfish or self-focused. So there's all of those kind of barriers that kind of get in the way. So what can we do to kind of walk this path then of being visible, but doing it in a way that we're celebrating ourselves and we're getting the recognition that we deserve, and that people get to see us for our potential, particularly as we've talked about, if you're a working mum that might choose to work more remotely, because either, as you said, if you're facing other biases, that actually it just feels more safe, but equally that from a logistics perspective, juggling a family, actually that's more convenient, but then you might be at a disadvantage because of it. What are some of the things we can practically do?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is reflecting on where your mindset is at with this stuff. And you kind of nicely just reeled off a few of the most common objections that I hear of, self centered and obnoxious. This is for people who have got lots of time. This, I don't want to be a show off. And I think in this context of visibility is where I see binary thinking cause the most harm. So I would urge you listening to think about what are these binary ideas that you have decided are true. So it's either I'm an introvert and I'm in the background and I've got my head down and my work will speak for itself. Or you have to be a big obnoxious show off on a stage. And there's a million versions of that. And once you recognize that that binary thinking is false, you can then start to explore. And I think that's what it's about, like exploring with curiosity. Like, oh, what might a graceful place in the middle be? Where might I fit on that? What is it? Look around you at people who you see being visible in a way that you find inspiring or motivating or gentle or ambitious or exciting, and try and not fall for that common trap of it's either something you are or it's something you're not. And recognizing that these myths around, if I just do a really good job, the rest will come, is fundamentally not true. It is absolutely not true if you're a woman, even more not true if you're a woman who's a mother, even more not true if you're a black or brown woman who's a mother. You cannot, good work does not speak for itself. We do not live in utopia. You need to work hard and be very intentional to own your work, to own your story, to own your voice, to talk about yourself and your work in a proactive way. And I've got two ways you can think about doing that. Is one is kind of small and simpler, and another one is a kind of bigger project. And the small and simpler one is to learn to say thank you. And it sounds simple, but it is amazing to me how much women struggle to just say thank you when they are given a praise, compliment, some sort of positive feedback. The thank you is then met with a monologue of, here are all the reasons why what you just said to me is not true, or here are all the reasons why I want you to go and, it's like, look, a shiny airplane, stop looking at me. So, it's, oh, thank you, but actually it wasn't me, it was my team. Oh, thank you. It really was nothing. It was so simple. It took me 5 minutes. Just constantly minimizing, belittling. And so I want you to practice saying thank you, nothing else. And if you practice when the stakes are low, you said to me before we went live, you liked my bookcase. Like, thanks. And I told you a wee story about it. that was a low stakes place for me to practice saying thank you without trying to deflect that compliment with all my being. And so when you practice when the stakes are low, it means when the stakes are higher and you're in a work context, you're more comfortable claiming credit, taking credit as your own. And there is a way to do that in a way that still acknowledges your team. Like, this comes up a huge amount. Like, women get so stressed by the idea of not acknowledge not acknowledging all the people that they work with. And it's not either or, it's not binary. You can do both. And, if that's something that you struggle with, I would think about all the people in your team who are watching you for what it looks like to take credit and to own your talent and to own your skills. And if you're constantly deflecting and minimizing, even if it's trying to push it onto them, you're teaching them that leaders who look and sound like you don't take credit. And so, you're reinforcing the stuff that we're trying to overcome. So I would think about saying thank you. And then the other one is a bigger one. And it's, we could do a whole other podcast on this topic, but it's this idea of learning in the open. And I think about it as, like, most people work and learn in the dark. So you have a document on your computer that only you can see. Maybe you've got a sketchbook that nobody else gets to look in. You've got lots of ideas jotted down, but you don't talk about them. People don't see them. You've got many, many wonderful business ideas in your head, but they're never verbalized. Learning and working in the open is the opposite of that. So you are regularly, that might be through Twitter, might be through LinkedIn, might be through conversations, might be through Medium articles, going to events, talking to podcast hosts. You are talking, sharing, articulating work in progress, sharing drafts, sharing half-baked ideas. And this is something that I have done my whole career, again, because as a designer, that's what you're taught to do. It's like the faster you can share that shitty first draft, the more points you're going to get. So I'm very lucky that it comes very naturally to me. And I do think it's a huge reason why I have built up the community that I've built up, and a community that's so loyal and engaged, because I have been talking to them very openly and honestly about a lot of stuff for many, 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 many years. And there's lots of different versions of what learning in the open looks like. There's a brilliant book by an artist called Austin Kleon called Show Your Work, which is a bit like a cartoon book. I mean, you could read it in an hour, but it's one I go back to time and time again. And so I want you to think about, for you, what might learning and working in the open look like? And if you're a perfectionist, the idea of this is going to make your skin crawl. And that's a big red shiny flag that this is something that you should kind of look at and consider. Because ultimately, for me, that's what visibility is. It's learning in the open, working in the open. And it's not about baring your soul and being vulnerable in the open. You can start in a place that feels very safe and sturdy for you, something that you could talk about with your eyes closed. But it's like getting used to sharing your thoughts and ideas with people who are not you, because all the things that you are keeping in the dark, keeping in notebooks, keeping locked in documents, and they die because they don't get oxygen.
I love that. And I think that kind of captures the essence of this about the proximity bias. How can you put yourself more into the open, even if it is that you're remote, even if that you are on maternity leave, had a career break, you are working physically remotely. How can you put yourself into those spaces? And from the sounds of it, is there's always going to have to be a degree of vulnerability. And what I'm hearing you say is you're not going to put yourself at the extreme edge of your vulnerability, but recognizing that putting yourself out there in any way, whether you're introvert or extrovert, there's a degree of vulnerability that goes along with that, about we're going to be judging ourselves for, oh God, are people going to think that I'm self-focused, self-promoting? But it's kind of leaning into that edge and, yeah, as you said, sharing it. And I'm wondering if you've got any other tips around, because there's a brilliant one. And I love that the thank you one is so simple, but it's such an effective one. Are there any other tips for people that might be kind of impacted by that proximity bias about how they can lean into that in kind of like a practical way?
Yeah, so there's one that I love from Cindy Gallop, who is the founder of Make Love Not Porn, and she is a brilliant role model in many different ways, but particularly around visibility. She talks a lot about visibility and age, because she, I think, is in her late 50s, early 60s, and she talks a lot about the bias of ageism, and how that shows up for women who are being visible, putting themselves out there. But she talks about the one thing that you can do and that I want you all to do is to say what you think. And again, it sounds really simple, but every day you are interrupted, talked over, mansplained, not heard, people stealing your ideas, you're, waiting in the Zoom room with your hand up and nobody picks you to speak. So you just stop it. You just kind of, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, you get to a place where you don't talk very much at work, or when you do talk, you're not really saying what you think. And I think it's really important that you say what you think for a few reasons. The first one is, like, you have been hired for a reason. You've been hired to deliver a unique piece of value that only you can deliver. And if you don't bring your unique perspectives and ideas and opinions to the table, you're not delivering that value. The second thing is, it's only when you start to say what you think as you begin to find out what you think. Because people will say to me, okay, I get all this, I'm on board, but I don't really have any opinions, or I don't have ideas, or I don't have a thing that I'm super passionate about, or I don't have a cause that I want to fight for. And it's like, you don't need any of those things, because it's by saying what you think that you start to understand what you think. You only find out the answers to those things by taking action. You can't think your way to those places. And then the third one, and this is my favorite, is that by saying what you think, you become like your own filter. So because you're being totally yourself, if you are not welcomed, championed, or celebrated, then you know that it's time for you to move on, because you're in a workplace that doesn't want you, because it's not accepting and celebrating what you think. And the people who agree with what you think, who are on board with what you think, they will find you. It's like, especially if you're talking online on the internet, it's like, you said when we were chatting before, you're on my mailing list. It's like, people join that mailing list because they see me say something somewhere and think, oh, I agree with that, or I like that, or that made me think. I want to know what else she thinks. What else is she going to say about things? And so if I don't say what I think, how are those people going to find me? Or how are those people going to know what I think about things? And hopefully you'll have heard from this conversation, none of us have clear books that we carry around with, this is what I think about topic XYZ. The stuff that we're talking about is inherently complicated. Being human is really hard and really complicated. We're all figuring it out. But I think saying what you think is a really powerful one. And like all the things we've talked about in this podcast, you do not have to do these things by yourself. It's like, find a pal, find a buddy, find a friend, message me, message Nikki. It's like, there's lots of us all over the world who are building whole careers and companies out of trying to change these norms. And that's what we're here for, to support you and to help you feel less alone as you try and shift some of these things for yourself.
I love that, Lauren. Thank you. And we've covered so much, but if there was just one thing that you want somebody listening to this conversation to take away, what would you want that to be?
That the fear that you feel around visibility or your self-doubt or your lack of confidence is not your fault. And even if you think your confidence is so lost that you'll never get it back, I promise you with my whole heart, you can absolutely get it back and even more. You can get it back and then some.
Oh, I love that. What a reassuring and kind of hopeful message. So I'm sure people are going to want to find out more about you and what you do. So where would you point them? And also you've mentioned about the bond program that I know you've got coming up as well. So could you talk us through about where people can find you and any links like that?
So I'm really active on Instagram and LinkedIn, so you can find me there at Lauren Curry. Weareupfront.com is Upfront's website, and we have our 2023 bond is our bond 7, so our 7th cohort, starting on June 5th, and it is a 6-week purely online. We have videos, we have weekly lives, and we have a community. It is a playbook on all things confidence, public speaking, power, presence. It is free if you're on maternity leave. So if you're on maternity leave, drop me a message. We'll send you your free ticket. And if you would like to buy a ticket, we have a discount code for all of Nikki's listeners, which is All You Need Is Love, which is in the show notes. And I mean, this program is our 7th cohort. I think I said before our last bond was over 500 people. You'll meet people from all over the world. Your relationship with confidence will be transformed. The average salary increase for a bond graduate is 49%. So I would love to welcome you. If you're curious, as you can probably tell, I can talk about this stuff all day. So follow me, sign up to the newsletter, check out our podcast, Upfront Moment, and come and join Bond 7. We'd love to have you.
Fantastic. And I will put all the links in the show notes, which is wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk/107, which is episode 107, and they'll all be in there. So Lauren, thank you so much for joining me, giving us your time and insight and the work you do in the world.
Oh, thank you so much. I've really loved this conversation. You asked really good questions.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too, so if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.